Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in the Spring 2024 series presented by Newton Conservators. Tonight's presentation that we're really looking forward to is Coexisting with Coyotes in Our Suburban Community. It's really wonderful to see so many people from Newton and our neighboring communities. Welcome. My name's Beth Wilkinson. I'll be the moderator of this virtual event, and Barbara Bates is our technical director. As many of you know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961 that connects people to open space, that works to preserve and maintain open space in Newton. The Conservators are grateful for the beauty and sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share the earth. We acknowledge the Massachusetts stewardship of this land that kept its ecological communities vibrant, strong, and interconnected for thousands of years. Tonight's presentation by Dave Wattles will teach us about the eastern coyote biology, how coyotes use suburban areas, and how communities can take effective steps to coexist with coyotes. Dave has been studying and working with large mammals in Massachusetts since 2006, when he began collaring and studying moose for his graduate work at UMass Amherst. He has 15 years of experience conducting black bear research and has been the black bear and Furbearer biologist with the Massachusetts Divisions of Fisheries and Wildlife, MassWildlife, since 2016. Now, let's get ready to learn all about coyotes. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here tonight. So as Beth said, this presentation is designed to provide you some information on the eastern coyote biology, its ecology, and how that then feeds into its behavior and how it is acting and living in your community, and how we can take advantage of its behavior and its natural ecology to learn to coexist and best coexist with these animals that are going to be a part of our communities moving forward. I know we have folks tonight from Newton, Brighton, Arlington, Belmont, surrounding communities where coyotes are living and interacting with your communities every single day. So hopefully you come out of this with more basic information about the species, but also more tools to better coexist with them. So what are we talking about when we talk about an eastern coyote? In reality, it's a medium-sized canid. So it's about the size of a border collie, around 30 to 40 pounds for a mature female, 35 to up to 50 pounds for a male. Very, very rare that you see a coyote exceed 50 pounds. In reality, they're about 4 to 5 feet from nose to tail. They have long, thin legs and a narrow nose and can have a huge variety of color types. They can be entirely black, blonde, red-colored, brown, gray, or the combination between that we typically see a mix of these colors. And they have very thick fur coat. And this fur coat is quite often why we get reports from the public that, I saw a coyote the size of a German Shepherd. In reality, you're looking at this medium-sized canid. The animal on the right is really basically the same as the animal on the left in the summer coat versus the winter coat. So when they've fluffed out their winter coat on a cold day, it can add a considerable bulk to that animal that makes it look much larger than it actually is. Coyotes weren't historically found in the eastern United States. Their historic range was really concentrated and restricted to the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains of the Midwestern and Western parts of the country, up into Canada and down into Mexico. Conditions changed following European colonization, the biggest change being basically the conversion of eastern forests into farmland. This change in conditions allowed western coyotes to expand to the east, which they did so very rapidly, to the point where now they are one of the most abundant and widespread species in the entire eastern United States. At the time of this expansion, when you just had a few coyotes, the first coyotes dispersing, you had very low densities of wolves, particularly around the Great Lakes states at this point. You had feral dogs and outdoor dogs. Western coyotes mated with both wolves and domestic dogs. So the animal that colonized the eastern United States has a mixed genetic background. It is composed of primarily coyote DNA, so 60 to 85% of their genetic makeup is western coyote, with lesser parts around 8 to 25% wolf. There's more wolf the further you go to the north. and 8 to 11% domestic dog. More domestic dog the further we go into the south. But this is the animal that originally colonized Massachusetts. This isn't a new phenomenon. So the term eastern coyote really refers to and distinguishes this mixed genetic canid from its more purebred western relative. Coyotes first arrived in Massachusetts in the late 1950s. The towns that you're going to see here in red are towns where we first documented the presence of coyotes. This could be a roadkill, an animal that was trapped in research, what have you. So by 1959, just a couple of towns. By 1980, coyotes had already spread throughout a large portion of the state. Again, these are just the towns where it had been documented, so you can fill in a lot of the spaces in between here where coyotes were already existing as well. By 1990, they've been documented in the majority of the state. And by 2000, we documented them in every city and town in mainland Massachusetts. We have since, in recent years, documented them on the vineyard. It may be as few as a single animal that's on the vineyard, but there may now be a couple of animals that are starting to get themselves established on Martha's Vineyard as well. Around 2000 or so, or shortly after, we started to reach approaching our current levels of coyotes, where coyotes started to saturate the landscape, if you will. They're a territorial animal, and so at this point, or approaching this point, essentially all coyote territories started to be filled. And this is the point we're at today. All suitable habitat has coyotes living in them, and basically the entire state has coyotes. And this is approximately the distribution and the abundance of coyotes we're going to have into the future. One of the things about coyote biology is they're not going to just keep increasing indefinitely because of the way their populations are structured and some things about their inherent biology. The main reason why coyotes were able to very, very rapidly expand their range and adapt to Massachusetts, the entire eastern coast, as well as highly urban places like Boston, is because of their very broad diet. They're omnivorous, meaning they'll eat basically just about anything, so plants and animals. But the bulk of their prey base, the bulk of their diet, is rodents and small mammals. So mice, rats, voles, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, woodchucks make up the bulk of their prey. But they'll also readily take advantage of ground nesting birds and their eggs, larger insects like crickets and grasshoppers. And it's very common at different points in the summer to find scats that are entirely composed of fruits. Berries of different type, apples, they'll readily feed on. They will also feed on white-tailed deer, but unlike wolves, they're not true pack hunters. So for the most part, they're not taking down adult deer. When they do, it's likely an injured animal, an animal that's suffering at the end of the winter. So they're taking the sick and the weak, but primarily feeding on fawns in the spring. Deer fawns are highly vulnerable to predation in the initial days and weeks after they're born, and are preyed on in Massachusetts by black bears, bobcats, and coyotes. Coyotes will also prey, or scavenge rather, on dead animals, including deer from the fall hunting season. Another aspect of their diet, and a hugely important one for your community, is coyotes' ability to take advantage of human-associated foods. This is really why coyotes can live in places as highly developed as Boston, Newton, and the surrounding areas, despite the, relatively speaking, limited amount of natural habitat available to them. One of the biggest sources of food, human-associated foods out there, is bird feeders. And in reality, from the bear presentations I give, I slash out the bird feeders here and cross it out and name it wildlife feeders. There's really no such thing as a bird feeder. If you're putting out bird feeders, you are feeding wildlife of all types. And you know this from the squirrels, the chipmunks, the mice, and the rats that are coming to your bird feeder. Coyotes will also feed on birdseed, but they're also attracted. Those are their main prey animals. So you're basically creating a prey station for them to feed at. They'll also readily feed at garbage and compost. So this is both household garbage if it's unsecured, as well as dumpsters that potentially are overflowing or open. Unsecured compost piles like this, they'll readily feed in as well. They'll also feed on outdoor pet food. So those folks that are feeding outdoor cats, you are also feeding skunks, raccoons, and coyotes and other animals. Unfortunately, and this is really the largest source of real conflict we have with coyotes, they'll also feed on and see our small dogs and cats as potential prey items. And in reality, from a wildlife biology perspective, we believe this is normal coyote behavior. This is because they can't distinguish between our dogs and cats and how they would a woodchuck, a squirrel, or any other potential prey item. The vast majority of these incidents are on unsupervised pets. And so the reality is, and we'll talk more about this later, it's really critical that folks directly supervise their pets when they're outdoors, or coyotes do see them as a potential prey item. They'll also readily feed on unpicked vegetables in gardens, fruit that's fallen from trees. That's an opportunistic free meal from coyotes. And also livestock, primarily free-range chicken, sheep, and small livestock that's not directly supervised. We're not going to talk a lot about that in this presentation. And unfortunately, there are also folks that are intentionally feeding coyotes. This figure is from a coyote collaring study that has been conducted in Rhode Island. All of those dots are times where an individual coyote visited this location. You can see all those lines on there. Those are the movement pathways drawing this coyote into this intentional feeding site. This has a number of negative consequences. It's basically training that coyote that the best place to find food is around people's homes, causing them directly to associate people with food. And intentional feeding, we've determined, has been the single number one driver of incidents where coyotes bite people in Massachusetts in recent years. So I know there's folks from Arlington tonight. There were 3 children bitten a couple years ago in Arlington, and this was directly associated to intentional feeding. We've seen this multiple times on beaches on Cape Cod, where a coyote, there's known intentional feeding, a coyote bites someone. It was actually killed by the National Seashore. A year, almost the day later, another coyote bit someone on that same beach. This is despite us at the time only having documented about 20 to 30 coyote bites on people overall time in Massachusetts. And the intentional feeding on this one beach directly caused 2 of those. So it shows you the hugely disproportional role that intentional feeding can have on driving these incidents. So I'll say it now, I'll say it again later. If you know anyone who's intentionally feeding, please contact us, contact your local police, Board of Health. There are existing Board of Health prohibitions that can cause someone to stop feeding if they're doing so. Because coyotes can use such a huge variety of food types, they can live in just about any type of habitat. So the natural grasslands and shrublands that made up their native habitat in the prairies and grasslands of the Midwest, agricultural lands, our forests, wetlands, they can find food in all these environments. And because of their ability to adapt to human-associated foods, they can also thrive by taking advantage of those foods in suburban and urban places like Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles that have resident coyote populations. And this is, again, how they're using Newton. So, I'm commonly, when I get calls from the public or there's an issue associated with coyotes, I call up the location on Google Earth. And how coyotes are using these areas is they're using the natural forested parks. They're using golf courses. They're using cemeteries. They're using areas around wetlands, the riparian corridors along streams and rivers. They're knitting together several of these natural and semi-natural habitats to make a territory. And then they're going through our neighborhoods, our backyards, and our communities to take advantage of all the foods we have around our homes. And that's how they make a living in your community. There are a number of important life history events throughout the year for coyotes. One of the biggest ones is their mating season. This takes place in the winter months. In reality, it's from like late January into March. We had a video sent to us a couple weeks ago, probably pushing a month ago now, of young coyote pups already coming out of the den that had to have been born in early February. That meant that mating was taking place definitely in relatively early January this year. This is a time of year where we can see a lot of aggression from coyotes towards large dogs. Just like with our small dogs as a potential prey item, they interpret coyotes or large dogs like they would another coyote in their territory. Coyotes are highly territorial. They will actively defend their territory against other coyotes. And so they interpret these large dogs like they would an intruding coyote. And so we can see attacks on dogs as large as German Shepherds, Labs, Pit Bulls during the mating season. So it's critically important, even if you have a large dog, to directly supervise it when it's outside. Right now, we're in the coyote pupping and denning season. This is the only time of year where coyotes are tied to a den. The pups are born in a den, and until they get large enough and mobile enough that they can start moving around, 8 to 10 weeks or more, the entire family activity is concentrated around that den. We can see a lot of incidents this time of year of coyotes being aggressive towards people walking their dogs and dogs walking in the vicinity of their dens at this time of year. So if you're out walking through a forest, in your neighborhood, you're regularly seeing suddenly that you haven't before an aggressive coyote down a trail. There's a high possibility that there's a den in the vicinity. The best bet really is to avoid that area for the next 8 to 10 weeks. Let those coyotes raise their pups. After that, they'll disperse, they'll leave that den, and you won't see that aggression in that area into the future. Throughout the summer, those pups are now getting larger. They're starting to move about, and the adults in the family group are basically taking them out in pairs and in small groups and teaching them how to be coyotes, how to find food around your community, how to move through and navigate the streets in the developed areas, and basically just how to be a coyote. By the fall, those pups that were born in the spring are now nearly fully grown, and they start to disperse, and they'll be on their own for the rest of their lives, or until they establish a family group of their own. In the fall, we can get reports of a population explosion. If you have a family group that's living in your area of 2 adults, maybe a couple of subordinate pups from a previous litter, and then the pups born that spring, by the fall, those 4 to 6 pups that may be born that spring suddenly are doubling the size of the number of mature-sized coyotes in your area. But that's a temporary thing. Most of those pups are going to disperse and be on their own, and you'll go back to that relatively constant level of coyotes in your area. But I just want to talk about howling. A lot of times we'll get calls from the public. I heard coyotes howling out in the woods or behind my house last night. Are they think they're going to come and attack us, or they're going to come and attack my dog? Howling isn't a sign of predation or that there's malicious intent to it. It's simply their means of communication. It's how coyote family groups don't often travel as an entire pack. They'll go out as individuals, pairs, small groups, and it's how they speak to one another and say, hey, I'm over here. Okay, I'm over here. Come back over here. We'll get together. It's how they defend their territory against transients or other coyotes. They use it to mark their territory. They use it to attract a mate in the breeding season, and the pups will practice during the summer and when they're learning to communicate. One of the things that the sound show is that it's very difficult to say how many coyotes there are in an area. I'm very familiar with coyotes, but I can hear them howling, and it can sound like a lot of animals there and be kind of an unnerving sound. I fully understand that, but it doesn't mean that they have bad intent. You kind of got it. You could hear the different tones, the different yelps, and it sounds like one's a little here, one's over there. It's fading in and out. So it's just difficult to tell exactly how many animals you have when they're making these vocalizations. I've talked about it a couple times, but I want to talk about how coyote populations are structured. This plays a key role in their resilience to management of the population or historic efforts to try to control and limit their populations. The main component of coyote populations are family groups or packs. They're highly territorial, so there will be probably multiple family groups that will make their territory in some part of Newton. So they may have 3-4 different family groups that are using different portions of town. Those family groups consist of an alpha pair. So the mated male and female, those are the two that are mating and raising and producing pups. Generally speaking, there's a couple of subordinate members of the family group. This could be offspring from a previous litter that didn't disperse. It could be a subordinate sibling of one of the alpha pair. And then there's the pups that are born every spring. The population also consists of transients. These are individuals that have dispersed from their family group. They have yet to establish a family group of their own, establish a territory of their own. These animals tend to have very large ranges that kind of are in and around the territories of all the established coyote families. These animals are constantly striving to find a mate and to establish a territory of their own. And so this plays a key role in, if we have mortality of the population, why the population continues to persist and remain steady over time is partially because of these transients. Another thing that controls coyote populations is simply food availability. Coyotes are very, very strong in their ability to respond to the availability of food. Quite simply, the more food there is, the more coyotes an area can support. So think about it this way. If that female who's breeding is in good body condition, she can produce a larger litter size. She's going to have more milk for them. There's going to be more food to bring back to those pups, so they're going to have higher survival rates. They're going to mature quickly because they're being fed well. And you tend to have larger family groups. Basically, there's enough food to go around that not all those pups have to disperse. And so you tend to have large family groups living in any area. They tend to have smaller territories because they don't need as much area to meet their life history needs. And you tend to have lots of coyotes living in those territories. In overall coyote density, kind of counterintuitive to what we think. I think in most settings, people would think, all right, where are we going to have the most wildlife? It's going to be in natural settings, entirely natural settings, forests, wetlands in Massachusetts. But in reality, studies have shown that coyotes tend to exist in higher densities in urban and suburban areas because of all the human-associated foods found there that supplement their natural diet and allow them to exist in higher densities. Whereas in these natural places, they're solely dependent on natural foods, and so they can't exist in these high densities. Because that's exactly what we see. If there's less food available, they tend to have smaller litter sizes. Pup survival may be poorer because the female loses milk more quickly, or there's not as much food to bring back. The pups don't mature as quickly, so they're not breeding at a young age. And you tend to have smaller family groups. This is because those pups have to disperse. There's not enough food for them and the pups from the next year, so they're basically kicked out by their parents. So we tend to have coyotes with larger territories because they need a larger territory in order to find enough food, with fewer coyotes living in there, and overall lower coyote density. So that's kind of our base coyote biology portion, where we'll tie in some other coyote biology as we move on. I'm going to talk about kind of removal of urban coyotes. Whenever there's conflict in an urban situation, we get calls to, what can you do? You've got to do something to control the coyotes in our area. And as a wildlife biologist, wildlife manager, the two main tools that we have for controlling wildlife populations or limiting the size of wildlife populations are hunting and trapping. Those are the tools that we use to regulate the size of populations. I'll also talk about relocation. So trapping. Trapping is one of the main means of potentially capturing a coyote. However, the traps that are effective for catching a coyote were made illegal in Massachusetts by a ballot referendum in 1996. So the traps we're talking about here are foothold traps or cable restraints, or what were traditionally known as snares. All these are live capture traps. And I will say that, contrary to a lot of the beliefs about these traps, they've been made very safe, and a lot of efforts have been made over the years to make them very safe and effective for catching animals. To the point where, as a wildlife researcher, if I wanted to conduct a study on coyotes, these are the traps that I would use to try to capture coyotes. And obviously, my goal is to capture coyotes uninjured, unharmed, so that I have accurate biological information in the study. Regardless of that, these traps are illegal and can't be used. So there's basically zero trapping of coyotes in Massachusetts. That's because the only traps that are legal to use are box traps. Coyotes, being a very, very wary species, will not enter a box trap, or will not readily enter a box trap. You can catch a coyote in a box trap, but what you have to do is you have to bait that trap and lock it open with food in there for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months. And you may eventually get a coyote that's willing to enter that trap and may catch it. But it's not very effective at all. And often it's counterproductive to whatever your goal may be, because you're attracting every coyote under the sun to that area and feeding them. So in reality, there's essentially zero trapping of coyotes in Massachusetts. As I said, our other means of limiting populations is through hunting. Obviously, in urban and suburban places, there are laws and regulations in place that control where someone can hunt. So you can't hunt within 150 feet of a road, 500 feet of a dwelling without permission. There's additional local ordinances. So obviously in places like Newton, Arlington, etc., there's no hunting of coyotes. Because of the combination of these things, there are almost zero coyotes that are removed from urban and suburban situations, even in instances where coyotes become a public safety threat. So, for example, going back to that incident where coyotes bit 3 children in Arlington, I don't have traps that I can use there. So basically it falls on police and environmental police to potentially encounter a coyote and then be able to shoot it in a safe location. One, encountering a coyote is far easier said than done. And then actually being able to safely dispatch it is another thing entirely. So even in those circumstances, it is very, very rare that coyotes are removed in these situations. So relocation, it's really not an option. There's a number of reasons for this. One, it's practically impossible. We talked about the limitations on trapping before. So the other option would be us going out and trying to dart a coyote. I could come out to your community 1,000 times and maybe never see a coyote. I know you are all seeing coyotes in your community, but in reality, think about how often you actually see one. A couple of times you've maybe seen one, and what you would have to do to predict exactly where you were going to be to go and actually find one if you needed to. And then I have to get within maybe 10 to 15 yards to potentially dart it, and that just those combinations of things doesn't happen. Additionally, it's not fair to relocate, and we won't relocate a problem animal to another community. That's just transferring that problem from your community elsewhere in the state. You'll often see on the news possibly that we relocate moose or bears. That isn't because that is a problem animal, and it is a hard policy that we do not relocate bears that are causing problems, causing property damage. We won't do that. Those are just animals that end up in a highly urban situation where their mere presence is likely to cause a vehicle collision. So we're moving them out of that urban area to a wooded area nearby so that we're just alleviating that immediate situation. This is because even we as a state aren't moving animals all over the place. It has the potential to spread diseases and cause other issues. And for coyotes, quite frankly, it's not humane for the animal. You're dropping that animal into the territory of other coyotes. It's going to be persecuted and attacked by those animals. And so essentially, relocation isn't something that is an option. We wouldn't allow it, but it's not practical to do either. So this means basically we're not removing animals. But let's say I had unlimited hunting in your community. I could use any trap. Would I be able to control coyote populations? The surprising answer to that is no. I mean, there have historically been efforts with bounties elsewhere in the country, poison, year-round hunting seasons, you name it, and we haven't been able to control coyote populations. And this is partially because of how their populations are structured. So say there's mortality in one of the alpha pair. Remember, you have these transients there that are constantly looking for a mate. They'll quickly come in and fill that role so that family group continues to function as it normally did. Or one of the subordinate members of the family group may take that role. Say you lose both of the alpha pair, you could have a situation like this. Regardless of the exact dynamics of how this works, if there's a void in a territory, coyotes fill it almost immediately. And so there's really not a gap in reproduction. So say we have our original population size and we have mortality from any factor, whether it's vehicle collisions, diseases, hunting, or other factors. Does that temporarily reduce the population? Obviously it does. But what that does is that decreases the competition for resources, the competition for food. So that means there's more resources there for the coyotes that remain. This results in high pup production, and so you get back to the original population size basically within a year. And so there's places in the country where they do still have year-round coyote seasons. They can use all sorts of traps where they do remove very large numbers of coyotes during their regulated seasons. But there's those same number to be removed again the next year. Basically, the population declines, bounces right back up, and there's very little control long-term of the population. So this is why we say this is approximately the distribution and the density of coyotes that we're going to have now in the future. And it's why we talk about the importance to learn to coexist and to prevent conflicts with coyotes. Because they are a species that causes real and perceived conflict for the public. One of the biggest type of conflict is simply the perceived threat. The mere presence of coyotes in people's neighborhoods, in their yards, in their communities, people find threatening. You know, obviously coyotes are living in very urban places, places where people aren't as used to dealing with wildlife. And dealing with a larger animal like coyote, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions in people's minds. And so they have very real fears and issues associated with having these animals around. So we take hundreds of calls a year dealing with these situations and try and help people understand some of what's going on. The most real form, as we talked about before, of conflict is depredation or attacks on dogs and cats. This is very, very common in Massachusetts. It's also highly underreported to us. In an average year, I may get 10 to 20 incidents reported directly to me or our agency as a whole, rather, of dogs and cats being attacked by coyotes. But anytime that, and in most of these incidents, I don't find out from the public. I find out when we get a call from a reporter asking us to comment on an incident, or I'm talking about an animal control officer about something else, and they'll say, "Yeah, we had 4 dogs and 3 cats over the last couple months that were taken by coyotes." We did a presentation in Hopkinton not too long ago. In one of the adjacent towns, their ACO told us that they had over 20 attacks on dogs in their community in the previous time. So this is very, very, very common. The good news is it's almost always unsupervised dogs and cats. So this can be prevented, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. There's also livestock depredation. This is mostly on free-range chickens and smaller livestock like sheep and goats. I'm not going to get into this here, but if you or anyone you know is having issues with livestock depredation, please contact us, and we're more than happy to help you through that. And then obviously the most serious form of conflict that we have with coyotes is bites of people. As I talked about before, almost all of these incidents are directly related to intentional feeding of coyotes by people. In the absence of that, these are very, very few. But we have seen an increase in recent years. I used to have a counter of the number of incidents here where I'd say, oh, we've only had 20 in our recorded history. But we're now getting to the point where it's probably more realistic and accurate to talk about the number we're having per year. And for the last 4 or 5 years, it has been 3 to 6 incidents. Again, with the absence of intentional feeding, these are very rare. A few rabid bites here or there, and other bites where someone is trying to defend their dog. The dog's off leash, they get into a tangle with a coyote, the person goes in, they're bitten in the process. This is despite coyotes being in every city and town in Massachusetts, in yards, in neighborhoods, next to playgrounds, next to schools. We still have a very, very, very limited number of these incidents to deal with on an annual basis. Most of the interactions we have with coyotes aren't true conflicts. Simply seeing a coyote in your yard or neighborhood, it's not a real conflict. Hopefully getting to understand them a little better, as we will tonight, that will help you to feel more comfortable about that. Having one sit and watch you mow your lawn, active during the day, not an indication that that animal's sick, perfectly normal behavior. Or having them watch you watch your dog, perfectly normal. The reason for this, particularly in your area, is because of the nature of these animals in suburban and urban situations. You have to remember that these coyotes were born and raised in your community. There's high densities of people. There's traffic. There's sounds of construction, horns, people walking everywhere. These coyotes are interacting and seeing those sights and sounds just like you are every single day, and they have for their entire lives. So they're used to these things. This is why when you're walking down the street and a coyote comes trotting in the opposite direction, it may not pay you any attention. This is why when it's out in your backyard and you say, hey, get out of here, it may not pay any attention. It's used to seeing people. And so it's important to take this in mind when we now talk about coexisting with them and changing their behavior, is that these animals are very used to dealing with people, and we have to do things in order to try to make them less comfortable in our homes and in our communities. This is because human behavior is a huge driver of wildlife behavior. As we've talked about a couple times now, I'm not going to hammer this too much more, intentional feeding. That is driving these things. If we remove the intentional feeding, there are very, very, very few bites of people by coyotes. Far, far more common, fortunately, is only intentional feeding. And this, I guarantee, is happening in your community, and I guarantee it's happening in some of your yards right now. This is the foods that we talked about before, the bird feeders, the compost, the pet food, the unsecured garbage, the free meals that coyotes are getting around our yards. These free meals are training coyotes that the best place to find food is in your yard, in your neighborhood. It's increasing the level of interaction you have with them. It's increasing the chances that there's going to be negative encounters with your pets. And so simply addressing these foods around our homes and our communities is going to decrease the presence of coyotes there. Also, because you're removing those foods that are supplementing the natural foods, over time, if you remove these foods, you're actually going to control more than I can as a manager the number of coyotes that live in your area. And then finally, it's a lack of harassment in body language and submissive body language by people towards coyotes. Coyotes naturally communicate with each other with dominance behavior. It's the dominant animals that get to establish a territory. It's the dominant male and female that get to mate and raise pups. It's the dominant pups that get more food. It's how they've learned to communicate their entire life. Dominance wins. If every time a coyote encounters a person, the person quickly turns and runs the other way, or they quickly jump into their car, or they run inside the house. Basically, that's teaching that coyote that it's dominant in the human-coyote relationship. Or people will say, I did haze, Dave, I did haze the coyote just like you told me. I said, what did you do? Well, I yelled at it from the back door and then I closed the door. All that's doing is saying to that coyote, hey, coyote, I'm over here. I'm going to go inside now and hide. You can do whatever you want in my backyard. And that's what these coyotes are learning over time. So changing these few behaviors can alter the way coyotes behave around us. So these are really the key messages I want you to take from this in terms of coexisting. There's 3 simple tasks and one overriding thing. Remove those human-associated foods around your communities. As I said, you're going to remove that direct attractant to your yard, your neighborhood that's training coyotes to come to those places. And over time, you'll actually lower the number of coyotes that live in your area. Harass and haze coyotes whenever you see them to increase the perceived threat they have of people, particularly if they're in your yard and in your neighborhood. Directly supervise your pets when outdoors. I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but almost all the attacks are dogs that are outside by themselves, or dogs. I can't tell you how often I'm talking to someone whose pet was just attacked, and they'll tell me, I was watching from the sliding glass door of the deck while the dog was out in the yard. And you'll see this in news reports as well. A coyote came out of nowhere and it grabbed it. Well, that dog is 20 or 30 or more feet away from that person in the dark quite often. That coyote is fixed on that dog. That person might as well be on the moon. It is your presence immediately next to your dog on a leash that is going to prevent these incidents from happening. And then the 4th overriding thing, obviously, I'm going to hammer you with it again, never intentionally feed wildlife. It causes so many issues. So the 3 things: remove those food sources, harass them, protect your pets, don't feed wildlife, and we'll learn to coexist. Because there's a million things around our homes that are attractants for coyotes. The garbage can or compost that's available for coyotes, that's a buffet. The outdoor pet, your pet is going to the bathroom in the yard. That's basically, for a coyote, that's marking their territory. The coyote knows it lives there. That's a potential prey item for them. The apples that have fallen from the tree, a free meal. That bird feeder that's spilling seed on the ground or suet, free meal for a coyote in attracting the mice, the rats, the chipmunks, the squirrels that are their natural prey. The crawl space under a shed, under a porch, under a deck, that's a place coyotes actually commonly den or can hide, so they actually can be right in your yard and you wouldn't even know they're there. The thick brush, the brush pile, the thick bushes between you and your neighbor's property, log piles, rock piles, those are places coyotes can hide and den right around your yard. Addressing these things, and you greatly reduce the attractiveness of your property for coyotes. So as we talked about, eliminate those food sources. Bird feeders, I know there are folks on this call who feed birds, and really you're feeding everything. I know there's a lot of concerns about the use of poison. Well, you're putting out bird feeders. In most communities, that is literally tons and tons and tons of seed that we're putting outside for wildlife. That can support huge numbers of rats. Your neighbor's putting out rodenticide and poisoning those mice and rats. This is a factor. It's the bird feeders that are the underlying cause of doing that. So look in the mirror sometimes if you're participating in that activity. Secure your garbage, whether it's at businesses or homes. If a business has an overflowing dumpster, you got to get another dumpster. Make sure it's emptied often enough so that's not happening. Use compost containers that secure your compost, and feed pets inside, and don't feed strays. Never intentionally feed wildlife. So now hazing or harassing coyotes. What do I mean? This means making loud, offensive, abrasive sounds to startle and scare off coyotes. Using aggressive body language, so bold posturing, direct eye contact. Don't run and retreat, but actually charge at the animal. So if you see a coyote in your yard, what I want you to do is run out at that thing like a crazy person, banging pots and pans, blowing a whistle, blowing an air horn, yelling at the top of your lung, taking and throwing small objects at it. So a snowball, a water balloon, a tennis ball, very small stones. So like pea-sized stones that you can fit a whole bunch of them in your hand, just to like throw a handful that's just going to startle it and scare it, but not injure it as you're trying to chase it off. You're trying to basically teach that animal, you come to my yard, you're not welcome. Every single time you come here, I'm going to do this to you. If you get to the edge of your property, keep chasing it. Keep chasing it into your neighbor's property as long as you have a good relationship with them. If there's woods behind your house, keep chasing it into the woods. Pick up a stick, bang it off of trees, throw it after the coyote. You're trying to drive it off. Spray it with a hose or a water gun, get creative and mix it up, and do it every time you see a coyote. This is going to be more effective if you do this, if your neighbor does this, if someone across the street does it, someone down the block does it. The more people that participate in this, the same with removing those food sources, the more effective it's going to be. You remove the food sources in your neighborhood, you remove that direct attractant for them to come to your community. Now you're aggressively hazing them, saying, you're not welcome here. They're going to go somewhere else. They're going to start using the natural areas in your community to find food rather than spending time in your neighborhood. That's going to decrease those unwanted encounters that some of you are having with them. So these are some of those ideas that I talked about for hazing. You'll see the cell phone there with no cell phone. Rather than standing there and taking a video that you're going to send to the news or post on social media or taking a picture you're going to send to friends, you're missing an opportunity to hazing. And you're basically saying, hey, I'm just a dumb person here standing with my cell phone. I'm no threat to you, coyote. You can continue to do whatever you want to do. Exactly counter to what you want to be doing. What should kids do? Kids should know the difference between a coyote and dog. But in reality, parents should be teaching their kids not to approach any animal they don't know. Kids are exponentially more likely to be bitten by a domestic dog than they are by a coyote. There are literally millions of bites of people every year in the United States by domestic dogs, and very, very, very few by coyotes. So really should not approach any animal they don't know. But if they do see a coyote, they should try to make themselves look bigger. Open up their coat, wave their arms over their head, try to distract it. Slowly back away, don't run. This is because running from a predator can cause it to naturally, instinctively chase after you. So it doesn't mean it has malicious intent when it runs after someone who runs away. That's just what they're going to do, like as soon as they see something run. So go inside, find an adult to harass a coyote. And the reality is, if the child isn't old enough to take these steps or not capable of making these steps, they probably shouldn't be outside by themselves and unsupervised by an adult. Next big component is protecting your pets. As we said, small dogs and cats are seen as a potential prey item for coyotes. Again, we consider this natural behavior if they're unsupervised because a coyote can't distinguish them, doesn't distinguish them in their natural prey. As we said, those larger dogs, particularly during the mating season, and if they're active around coyote dens, are seen as competitors or threats, and they're often attacked by coyotes as well. It is your presence, as I said, next to your dog on a leash that's going to prevent that attack. So pets should be directly supervised when outdoors. Dogs should be on leash when on walks. This is including in state forests and things. Some of the places where we have these serious negative encounters with coyotes are dogs that are running off leash on state forests and in our natural areas. And then just keep your pets up to date on their vaccines. That's always a good idea. You can also try to keep coyotes out of your yard. And so if you're going to put up fencing, we recommend it's at least 6 feet tall. It's buried a foot into the ground, or you can install an apron on it, as you see in the bottom picture. That's basically to prevent a coyote from digging under it. You want to make sure all the spaces in that around that fence are very, very narrow. A coyote can fit through something that's a very, very small gap. It'd blow your mind the spaces that animals can fit into. You can also install a roll bar on the top. This is basically if you string a piece of wire, you can put a piece of pipe around it, and you could even put another piece of pipe around that. If a coyote or something were to try to get up over that and get traction, that pipe will spin and it'll dump them off. Block off those crawl spaces under porches, sheds, and decks so that there's not places for them to den and hide in your yard. Cut back brushy areas, remove brush and log piles, rock piles. If you do have a coyote den in your yard, disturb it. Simply playing a radio or increasing human activity, shoveling a little bit of dirt in there can be enough of a disturbance. They won't tolerate a lot of disturbance near the den. They'll take those pups and move them somewhere else. Something that works really well if you do have a coyote that's denning under a shed or something like that is taking some rags, putting some ammonia on it, toss it under there. The off-gassing there is enough of an irritant. They'll take those pups and move them somewhere else. A lot of times we'll get comments from people. It's like, that's all well and good, Dave, but I'm terrified. I'm not going outside. I'm not going to take a walk. I'm not going to recreate anymore because of the presence of coyotes in my community. I just want to remind you that people are on trails. They're biking, they're hiking, they're jogging, in forest, in parks every single day. Coyotes are in yards, in neighborhoods, next to schools, next to playgrounds, next to hospitals, next to senior centers without serious incidents. So, kind of measure your anxiety about it based on that. But if you're afraid, carry a walking stick. Have a nice stout walking stick. If you encounter a coyote, you can bang it on the sidewalk. You can bang it off a trash can, off a telephone pole, what have you. Make some noise to scare it off. If you absolutely had to, you would have something you could defend yourself with. A rapidly unfurled umbrella can be quite startling. As you're yelling at a coyote, all of a sudden you got much bigger. You can do the same thing by having a trash bag in your pocket. Rapidly unfurling and filling a trash bag with air suddenly, again, as you're yelling and screaming, makes you look like you've doubled in size and you're suddenly a scary monster there. They also make repellent sprays, so they'll make a citronella spray. These are, if you search dog deterrent spray, dog deterrent citronella, that's in the upper left there. It's basically they're designed for aggressive dogs, for joggers, mailmen, those kind of things. Those would work on a coyote. Same with a self-defense pepper spray. They also make a product that's called bear spray. It's a type of pepper spray. It's designed to repel grizzly bears, 800 to 1,000 or more pound bears, very aggressive bears. It puts out a cloud of pepper spray out to about 20 feet. That's what's happening in that lower right-hand figure. It puts out a big cloud. So if you spray that into the wind, you just sprayed yourself in the face. If there's a crosswind and your neighbor's outside, you just sprayed your neighbor. So be careful about using a product like that in a developed location like yours. But these other types of sprays are things you can carry with you on a walk. And again, this is going to be the distribution of coyotes. They're going to be part of your community now in the future. We can appreciate them. We consider them an important part of our natural ecosystems in Massachusetts. And there are these simple steps you can take as individuals and as a community to coexist with them. Again, it's removing the human-associated foods around your homes and communities, hazing and harassing coyotes to increase their fear of people and the perceived threat they have of people. Directly supervising your pets are going to prevent those attacks from happening, and never intentionally feeding coyotes. We have a lot of resources available to you for help. I'm out of our main office in Westboro. That's our phone number there. You can call me or call another biologist if you have concerns or issues with coyotes. We just have updated. We have a new person who's working to update a lot of our outreach materials that I work with. She's helped to update our coyote page, and we just developed a new page. It's mass.gov/coyotes. So it's a simple website to get to. It's got information on hazing, these tips on coexisting, common FAQs. We've got a recording of a very similar presentation to this. Lots of resources that you can use as individuals or share with your community to coexist with coyotes. I also put the environmental police call log number. They're available 24/7. But if you ever were having a direct incident with coyotes or you thought there was an immediate threat, call 911. Your local police can get there immediately, whereas I only work 40 hours a week. The environmental police may not have an officer within a couple hours. Call 911. Your local authorities can deal, particularly with an aggressive coyote if needed. I do have one more topic that I want to talk about. This is something that we commonly have issues with in urban and suburban areas, and that's both fox and coyotes with mange. And believe it or not, the problems aren't with the disease and the condition itself with these animals. It's with people's actions and the recommendations that are put on social media that are very bad. with good mind. People want to help these animals, and we fully understand that. But there's often recommendations that someone should trap that animal, someone should give it medication. I'm going to tell you both now. Both of those things are illegal, and I'll tell you why that is here, because of the negative consequences, the likelihood that it's going to further spread mange in the population, poison other animals, and we'll talk about that in detail. But in case you don't know, mange is an infestation of mites. So they get these mites, the mites lay eggs, they burrow into the skin and lay eggs. That causes these lesions, and the hair loss is when they scratch and trying to deal with these lesions. It is a terrible infestation to have. How mange is spread in wildlife populations is through direct contact between an infected individual and a healthy individual. Basically, it's like a dog passing fleas back and forth to people. Or if your dog had fleas and you were to lay in your dog's bed, you're going to get fleas. And so this is another place that this can happen is if it's not direct contact, it's when a healthy animal and a sick animal are using that same area repeatedly, sometimes at den sites or at other places of concentrated use. One of those places of concentrated use is when people are feeding wildlife. Intentionally feeding wildlife leads to habituation. We talked about the issues that causes with coyotes. It causes nuisance wildlife, and it further spreads disease. People often think they're helping wildlife or that they love wildlife. I feed wildlife because I love it. No, you're killing those animals. You're helping to spread diseases. These wildlife feeding stations are one of the main places that mange is spread in populations. It's attracting both healthy and sick individuals, and that's how mange is spread from one animal to another. These feeding stations and all those human-associated foods in your communities also support high densities of fox and coyotes. Those are the natural conditions where mange persists in populations. So by maintaining these high wildlife populations, you're essentially guaranteeing that you're going to have the persistence of mange in your population. In reality, addressing these food issues is where you as the public can have the greatest effect on limiting and helping these wildlife. So what can be done? We do allow fox and coyotes to be captured and treated for mange. We require that someone check with us before capturing a coyote due to the issues with rehabbing them. They can be very easily habituated, and then they're not a candidate for release. But the limits on capture are with physical means. That means with a rabies pole, a pole net like you see here, a throw net, a blanket. Unfortunately, that means that it's very difficult to capture an animal that's still highly mobile. So if you have a fox or a coyote that has mange, but it's still running all over in town, it's not going to let someone approach it to capture it. So it does require, unfortunately, that animal's condition quite often to deteriorate until someone can approach it and safely capture it. Now getting on to the two main recommendations. Again, this is something you commonly see on social media when there is an animal with mange in a community, but I want you to know that it is illegal for anyone to attempt to trap coyotes or fox or other wildlife without special authorization from us to do so. It is also illegal for anyone. This includes veterinarians, rehabbers. It is illegal to purchase this online or get it from a veterinarian, and for anyone to give any type of medication to free-ranging wildlife. Both of those things are illegal, and I'll talk about why now. When I was first talking about capturing coyotes in urban situations, I talked to you about trapping. Both fox and coyotes are extremely reluctant to enter box traps. You can successfully trap them, but it takes basically turning that box trap into a feeding site in the meantime to maybe get an animal in time to potentially go into that trap. But you're now likely attracting every fox and coyote that lives in the area to that feeding site. So now how does mange spread? When all these animals are interacting and when they're using that same area. So now in our attempts to try to help this one sick animal, we're further spreading mange in the population. Obviously, I can't allow that to happen. We can't, as an agency, allow that to happen. So for ivermectin, that is the medication that is often used to treat mange. It's illegal for anyone to administer medication without a permit from us. At low levels, this drug is safe and side effects are rare. But at higher levels, it can cause blindness, neurological problems, paralysis, and death. And the dosage needed to successfully treat mange is hundreds of times the dose that is used to treat heartworm in dogs. So we give our dogs ivermectin to treat heartworm, but you have to give many doses and at much higher concentrations in order to successfully treat mange. And talking to wildlife rehabbers and wildlife veterinarians, not only do you have to treat the mite infection, you also have to treat the secondary infections of the lesions and things that they have. Otherwise, that animal is not going to get better. But even with our dogs, the dosage is highly weight specific. You give a different amount to a 10 to 20 pound dog than you do to a 30 pound dog, than you do to a 50 pound dog. If you think you can control the amount you're giving an animal, then you've already habituated, or what animal you're giving it to, you've already habituated that animal. You're basically intentionally feeding it. And we already talked about the issues associated with that. Additionally, let's remember how coyotes and fox feed their young. They consume food and then they regurgitate it to their young. So if you're feeding medication to a fox or a coyote, it's now regurgitating to its young. You gave that adult a dose that's suitable for it to treat mange. You just killed every single one of those pups or kits. Obviously not a good thing. Ivermectin is also poisonous to many other non-target animals, fish, invertebrates, birds, even some, though we give it to our dogs, it's toxic to shepherds, collies, and other dogs. And the effects on many species aren't known. So obviously we cannot allow medication like this to be given out willy-nilly to animals in the wild. We as a division have a responsibility to manage healthy wildlife populations and communities of wildlife, and we can't allow our management actions to potentially compromise domestic pets and other things. So we have to balance the potential treatment and helping an individual animal. Yes, that animal is suffering. No one wants to see that, but we have to balance that against the negative consequences for that community, the wildlife community as a whole, as well as the other animals. And because of the negative consequences of trapping and medicating, those simply can't be allowed. It's not because I'm heartless and I want to see that animal suffer. It's just the reality of the situation. Again, just a reminder of those three main points of coexisting with coyotes: removing the food sources, harassing coyotes, supervising your pets. Very, very simple, folks. You do those things and we can coexist with coyotes. With that, I hope you learned something about coyotes tonight. I hope you learned a bit about coexisting with them. I'd be happy to take any questions you have at this point.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dave. You gave us so much good information and you presented it so clearly. Thank you. And we have a ton of questions. So let's start talking about our questions. First of all, going back to the beginning, we have some questions about terms. And people want to know how a coy wolf or a coy dog is different than a coyote. They said they hear those terms a lot.
They're not. So the coy wolf is simply a term that, a couple people have determined that they want, and in reality, it's because they want to infer the protections that wolves get onto eastern coyotes. The accepted term for this animal is the eastern coyote. It's what all wildlife biologists and managers will use. The coy wolf is essentially like calling a mountain lion a puma, a catamount, what have you. It's just kind of another name, or when people call a fisher cat. So in reality, it's the same exact thing. But as I said, the name eastern coyote recognizes the fact that these animals do have this mixed genetic background. So coy wolf isn't some new thing. It's just a name that folks have given to the eastern coyote.
Great. My question: why is the mix of species more dog when it's farther to the south? Is it just because there are more wild dogs there?
Yeah, it kind of is, and it's in reality. There's no point where, like, if you were to take a coyote from Massachusetts and compare it to a coyote in New York, or a coyote or Pennsylvania, going west to Ohio, there's no point where you can say this animal is different than the western coyote. It's like a smooth gradient where gradually it will become eventually all coyote. And as you go north to south, it's kind of the same thing. There just tends to be a little bit more wolf DNA and a little bit more dog DNA as you go south. But there's no, like, you get to Maryland and all of a sudden, oh, this is the dog ones and it's the wolf ones up here. It's a smooth gradient as you go up and down.
Fantastic. We have someone who also said she gets mixed up between what's a coyote and what's a fox, and she would like some base points for making that distinction.
Yeah, so a fox in reality is going to be a much, much smaller animal. A fox is, around, 8 to 12 pounds, versus your coyote is a bit larger. We have two types of native fox in Massachusetts, a red fox, which is going to be basically orange. But in the summer, they can not have the most robust coat, and they can look but they're going to be a pretty small, thin animal at that time. We also have a gray fox, which much more resembles a coyote in coloration, in some of its appearance. But again, it's a much smaller animal. Both of those animals are going to be on the order of 10 to 15 pounds, really about the size of your cat versus about the size of a medium dog.
Terrific. Now I'm going to ask a smaller question before we get into the nitty gritty of what coyotes eat and how they attack. So someone wants to know, actually a couple people, 3 people want to know, how did the coyotes get to Martha's Vineyard?
Yeah, so coyotes have been on the Elizabeth Island. So if you go kind of like down the edge, the lower edge past Falmouth of Cape Cod, and I don't know if that's exactly where they are, but I basically think it's off the heel of Cape Cod, if you will. There's a chain of islands, the Elizabeth Islands, and coyotes have occupied those for a long time, and so they've got to somehow get from one to the next. And so that can be an animal that just suddenly decides to swim for it. For example, there was a bear last year that was down on the southern coast that just jumped off a dock and started swimming across a bay, and it was captured on video. So they will just occasionally do that. And it could be one that sometimes it gets caught in a rip current and just gets, sucked out and brought. There had been coyotes in the past that had shown up washed up dead on the beach. It's possible that one got onto the ferry. It sneaks on the ferry when no one's noticing and gets transported out that way. More than likely, it got into the current and got washed out there and established, most likely. And that's why, we started getting the first reports. It was before the pandemic. The first one started coming in about a year or so ago. All of a sudden, people on the island were saying, we're sure that there's multiple coyotes on here because we saw some up here and some down there. And it still could be very easy for a coyote, particularly if it's alone on the island, to traverse the whole island. So it's still not known whether or not it's just still that one individual that made it out there, or if there indeed have been multiple individuals that have made it out there. But we unfortunately don't know 100% for sure exactly how they got there, but those are some plausible mechanisms.
Terrific. And another island question. It's not quite your turf, but someone wants to know if there are any on Block Island.
I don't know, to be honest with you. I think that's a little closer to shore, but again, I don't know that very well. So I hesitate to answer that.
Terrific. Well, we've got so many more good questions still coming in, but we're going to start talking about what they eat. First of all, most people want to know what they can prevent them from eating, but we have a couple questions. One person wants to know why they don't eat more rabbits in their yard.
Yeah, I mean, so you have to, this is always where, we'll get, in some instances in parts of the state where there is hunting of coyotes and people don't want them hunted, for example, they're saying, well, you can't touch them because the rodents are going to explode. If animals like coyotes and fox could control rodent populations, we wouldn't have rodents around, or rabbits. So it's like predators can't fully control their rodent, the rodent or rabbit populations in any area. And to some instances, it may be easier to feed on all these human-associated foods than it is to hunt down prey. Rabbits are going to run away and could be a challenge to get. And so if they can just go and feed at a garbage can that's a free meal or this or that, they may readily feed on those rather than preying on all these animals. And while they are in backyards all the time, they still don't love to be out during the day just in the middle of your yard. So if the rabbit's out there, the coyote's going to still avoid those places. They're very good at navigating and avoiding human contact for a large part. Even though there is a lot of interaction, they don't want to be in your yard necessarily all the time when you're potentially there, hunting for those rabbits and things.
Do they eat turkeys?
There's not a whole lot that eats a turkey. Turkeys, it's still a relatively large bird. They can, I think probably when hens are on nests is probably when they're most susceptible to it. They're reluctant to leave the nest, and coyote might be able to sneak up on them. A lot, turkeys can flush and can fly, so they do have that escape mechanism, and they're still a pretty darn large bird. So there's probably, I'm sure they do prey on them, but it's not really enough to do much control of turkeys by any means.
Okay. We're going to talk more or not about what we want to keep. Well, this is what we want to keep them from eating. Rodenticide. Have there been any reported killings of coyotes from rodenticide, and how do you determine that?
Yeah, so the answer to that is none that have been verified. You've all seen the reports of raptors that have been poisoned. You have to keep in mind body weight of these animals. Raptors, a couple pounds versus a 40, 50-pound animal. There were studies in California that linked the impacts of rodenticide on bobcats and other carnivores in making them more susceptible to mange. So they drew that link, and the link there was that the rodenticide didn't kill them, but it compromised their immune system, therefore making them more susceptible to the infestations of mites and developing full-blown mange as a result of it. That's one of those where, did the animal have mange? Did it also have rodenticide? Was there really any causative link there? It's very, very difficult to draw that causative conclusion because they're not to be graphic about it, they're not bleeding out from the concentrations of rodenticide in them. But I know, so I work in a regional group with all the Furbearer biologists from all the New England states down to Virginia and West Virginia, and there are studies looking at the impacts of rodenticide on all our mesocarnivores, so fox, bobcat, fisher, etc. And it basically, you can't test one of these animals that doesn't come back positive for some levels of rodenticide. As I said before, these animals are feeding on those mice, the rats, and things that are attracted to birdseed. And unfortunately, bird feeders really are one of those main food sources for those animals. And you may love the birds and these things, and your neighbor may hate them, and they may be the person that's putting out the poison. So, that's one of those where, yes, removing the poisons is going to do this, but addressing that bird feeder and those issues is going to potentially remove the need to be putting out poison that someone feels. So there isn't a direct cause. We don't know if they're dying, but they very well may be, and that may be why we do see so much mange, is because of the impacts on rodenticides on their immune systems. But that's to some degree a little bit speculative.
Fascinating. You mentioned bird feeders. We have a question from somebody who says, if I have a 6-foot fence, may I have bird feeders within my 6-foot fence?
So the coyote won't be feeding at them, but that doesn't address the rodent issue that I just talked about. You're going to have a hard time with the species that I manage, right? I manage bears and I manage coyotes. Those are the two most common conflict-causing species in the state. And both of those are very much driven by issues with bird feeders, or a lot of them are. So, I'm the last one who's going to be saying, yeah, go ahead and put bird feeders out. In terms of directly, as I said, directly accessing the bird seed for that coyote, yes. But again, feeding wildlife and putting all this food out for wildlife, if it's not them, it's attracting the turkeys that are bothering people and whatnot. So there's cascading effects from putting all these food out.
We have other questions about what food might attract them. Someone who has a vegetable garden, I'm going to ask you two together, wants to know whether she has to worry about them coming to eat from her vegetable garden. And then someone else said, so are they omnivores? Are they carnivores? And those of us who are vegetarians, do we need to worry about our compost? So those sort of go together.
Yeah, I'll say at my old house, I had a compost that we had a small fence around, and we had a trail camera on it, and there were coyotes in that constantly. So, the half-rotten zucchini, the rotten piece of whatever that's out there, it doesn't matter how nasty it is when you put it out in the compost, it's still a free meal for them. I think a lot of it, they will. I mean, I've got a lab, and that thing will pick tomatoes off the vine. It will eat just about anything. So, these animals are opportunistic, and they will eat these. I think a lot of times it's the food that's, at the end of the season. And, you don't get to it because the zucchini's 1.5 feet long and you don't feel like making soup or whatever. And so you just leave it there. That's maybe something that they can come and feed on at some point. So, cleaning up those sorts of things, like I said, with the fallen apples out of a tree or whatnot, cleaning those things up, putting them in secure compost. The recommendation is absolutely to get one of those compost bins or those tumblers or whatnot, just to prevent access. Again, if it's not the coyotes, it's the skunks, it's the raccoons, it's the possums. They're all getting into these things. And again, they're causing conflict for different folks in the community. So securing those things. But in terms of your garden, I don't believe it's enough of attractant. It's not like we get reports all the time of coyotes feeding in gardens. It is just something that they can feed on.
Okay. And we had someone who also asked about native plants for birds and other wildlife that have berries and so I presume that's in the same category as a vegetable.
Yeah, it is. I think it's just picking those when they're ripe. Not cleaning up things that have fallen on the ground. I've definitely had videos sent to me of bears coming and picking at people's raspberry bushes and whatnot in places. So it will be an attractant. That doesn't mean you can't have those things. I think, I have blueberry bushes in my yard. Not very successful at getting them to grow, but we have them anyways. So, that's something I absolutely do not have a bird feeder or whatnot. But, we do have berry bushes. So, I wouldn't hesitate to have those things if you want to.
Okay, we're going to start moving into some questions about the tax. Because that's what we have a lot of concern about that. But I'm going to ask you one. We have someone who seems to know your work very well. Brendan says that he loves your paper studying seasonal moose distribution and migration patterns. Have you noticed patterns of habitat use for coyotes depending on the season? He would like to know.
Yeah, so I mean, with the moose, I was actively tracking, moose with GPS collars. So I did very, very detailed analysis of exactly where they were going, and we were looking how they changed their habitat use based on different temperatures, because moose can be thermally stressed here in Massachusetts. Looking at lots of different, very detailed things. With coyotes, we just kind of know generally what they're doing. And if it was an entirely natural landscape, coyotes, like all wildlife, are going to be in the places where they can find food. So they're going to be in wetlands and places. They're going to be in fields where they're feeding. If a farmer comes and mows his field, it's not common to have a coyote coming along behind the tractor, picking off the mice and voles and things behind the tractor, and hunting those as it's doing it. So they'll hunt in those places. I do a ton of hiking in the woods behind my house, and there's coyote tracks kind of everywhere in the woods. There's not necessarily a pattern, so they'll use just about anything. Again, in the urban places, the natural places that they're using, a lot of time in cemeteries, golf courses, abandoned lots, other overgrown places, the riparian corridors. We've got great wetland protection laws, so there's buffers around our wetlands that have little forested patches. Again, they knit those kind of things together. The little strips of woods, if you have like a street here to street here and a row of forest between them, those are little islands that they can use of natural habitat to go right up in between those houses. Because how often do people really spend time in those places? So they really spend a lot of time in the places where people won't go.
Thank goodness for them, they have that. Okay, we have a question here. Though scientists often state that coyotes are not pack hunters, residents online have begun to report finding themselves and their dogs being surrounded by small groups of coyotes at dusk or night. Is that their hunting behavior evolving along with their genes?
Yeah, I mean, evolution takes a long time to happen. And so while we say that they're typically not pack hunters, they're certainly capable of that. They do live in organized family groups. And so they do go out, as pairs, small groups to hunt. No question. We have gotten reports in the past about coyotes in some places that have gotten aggressive towards dogs, have gone in larger groups, and have pursued people with dogs as a result of that. The evolution to take the step up, to increase in size, to be more effective at hunting deer is something that would take a very long time. If we never get wolves back in the Northeast, is it something that is likely to happen at some point? Yes. Those animals that become successful at doing that, that's a huge food resource. And this is how evolution works. They get this big food reward because suddenly they can take down deer. That's a huge survival advantage for them and their pups. So they're likely to pass their genes on. So now you get those slightly larger animals that start to persist in the population, have learned that behavior to hunt. And those are the kind of things, how those things can develop at time. It tends to take very, very, very long. And we're talking hundreds and thousands of years for those sorts of things to develop. And anything appreciable in terms of an increase in size will take, much, much longer than that even.
So if people go out now when they're walking their dogs and see 3, 4, 5 coyotes, they're probably just doing their pack thing, wandering through, and they're not hunting as a pack. They're
Yeah, but more often than not. I mean, it's like as much as we have had some interactions with people walking their dogs with groups of dogs, with groups of coyotes. It's not something that's happening all the time. And I don't think it's necessarily truly just out there hunting. There's not the prey that would drive that. They're going to be more successful in reality if they are hunting rabbits or squirrels or woodchucks or whatnot as individuals rather than as a group. That's more likely to scare them off.
We were out walking our two dogs around 5:30 when it was still dusk a while ago, and three coyotes. I live right in Newton Center, and three coyotes came running down the street, and they actually seemed very much to want to go right by us and
Mhm.
not have anything to do with us. But it was gorgeous to see them.
Yeah,
Uh,
we'll get calls from the public too that someone will say like I was out with my dog or I was walking in the street and a coyote charged me. And I think I told you when we were on the phone the other day about this. And we'll say, okay, well, can you describe what happened? And they'll tell us something exactly what you said. Well, I was walking down the street and a coyote was running the other direction. And it's like, all right, what did it do when it got you? Well, it just kept on running. And so it's like, did it charge you or did it just run past you and completely ignore you? And then they're like, oh, well, yeah, I guess, it did completely ignore me. So a lot of times it's not aggressive behavior. It's just someone who's startled by the presence of these animals, and then making an interpretation of maybe not what reality happened there.
Okay, we're running out of time, and there's still more. Somebody mentioned that her dog was killed by a coyote, and someone else said that she's worried when she walks her dogs through Cabot Park and they're off leash, and it's a small dog. She's worried they're at risk. And from what you've told us, yes.
Yeah. Well, one, my condolences for the person who lost their dog. I have a dog. I understand how traumatic that can be. But fortunately, as I said, those things are largely prevented. Absolutely, the recommendation is to not have that. That is a very, very common scenario where dogs are attacked. They're off leash. You don't have control over them. They suddenly engage with a coyote. They're just far enough away from you. Again, it's that leash maintains that proximity to you, and it's kind of the aura, if you will, around you. That is the protection for your dog. If a dog's on the end of a 12 or more foot extendo leash too, that's starting to decrease that link to you. Or where if the coyote, we've had this described to us as well in certain circumstances, you're walking and the coyote sees your dog, but you're 10 feet behind it. It goes after that dog before it even realizes you're there because you're not directly next to it. So I absolutely would not recommend that people are out walking, particularly small dogs. Unquestionably, they are more vulnerable to attack by coyotes than larger dogs. It's typically the 10, 15, 20-pound dogs. Those are the ones that are being attacked more often. So I really would not recommend walking them off leash like that.
Now, you gave us great description of how to haze and great details, but someone wants to know if you are walking with your dog and you do have a confrontation with a coyote, do you still do the same thing? Do you change how you haze?
Yeah, I mean, with your dog, you do have to take into account that you have your dog there. I would still recommend being aggressive and trying to scare off that dog. If you have the presence of coyotes in your community and you're walking your dog, that's where you might want to carry the air horn. You might want to get a pepper spray or a citronella spray or something like that. Have a walking stick with you that you can, something else that can help you elevate your hazing and make you seem like more of a threat, because you're going to have your dog leash in one hand, so that's going to be full. So, having a walking stick that you can slam that thing. If you break that walking stick, get another one. But, it'll make some loud noise. It'll be startling, and you're going to come off threatening and dominant. The real thing is to not seem timid and afraid. You may be terrified out of your head, but be bold and be aggressive, and that's going to be enough should be enough to scare them off. If it starts to persist, you can pick up a small dog. Again, I would be warding off that coyote to make sure you keep it away. And you should still be able to haze it there, but just be as aggressive as you possibly can when you're doing that.
Oh, it's so hard to choose the last couple here. Okay, someone asks, should you not harass a coyote during mating season? How do you know that they're not guarding their den and they will become aggressive if you do that?
Yeah, so mating season and denning season are two different things. So mating season, they won't have a den yet. So it's really only this time of year where they're going to have a den. So it's more the pup raising season, the early pup raising season. The pups are born in that den, and until just think about puppies when they're born. They're little balls, and it's even when they're 8 to 10 weeks old, that's when you're first taking them home. They're still just this little ball of turd, and so it's not until they're older. That's the only time they're tied to a den. In the mating season, that's the winter months. They're just going to be around. They're going to be patrolling their territory, trying to keep transients out, other coyotes, whatnot. So you can still be aggressive to them at this time. If you encounter a coyote in a natural place or something, and all of a sudden you get this aggression, you can do some hazing to try to get out of that situation, right? So it's okay if you're bold and you're aggressive, but you still want to back out to get out of there with your dog. That's okay, but just don't kind of turn tail and run. Be aggressive with it, and then just avoid that area. Just not to tempt fate and potentially have the coyote coming after your dog. Like the next time, it's like, all right, well, you already know it's there. Let's use the park on the other side of town to walk your dog, or you go another block over to walk instead of going through that area.
Okay. We're going to end with two natural questions, naturalist sort of questions. When a coyote kills its prey, does it share the kill with its kin? And is that yelping that we heard, is that associated with that?
That's going to depend on the size of the prey. If it's just small rodents or whatnot, no. If they did happen to take down a large deer, absolutely, that would be something where they would do yelping and calling, and that carcass is now going to be a center of activity for for example, there was a deer carcass out here, and the amount of coyote activity down there was extraordinary. A number of tracks that were down there. But for smaller prey, not necessarily. But what they will do, they'll share it with the pups. So both the parents as well as those subordinate members of the helper pups will bring food back, and that's the primary thing. Yes, they're eating at that time, but their primary thing is feeding those pups at this time of year. So they're absolutely sharing that. Maybe something a little larger like a woodchuck, but they could easily consume a woodchuck just by themselves. So it's kind of going to depend on the food source.
Amazing. Okay. And Barbara, our technical host, says, what does it mean when a coyote yawns, opens its mouth at you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be speculating, to be honest, a little bit about what that exact communication is. It can be it can be a threatening, potentially, a posture, as it's showing its teeth. It can be potentially just a sign of nervousness. Sometimes it's just different expressions there. I'm not really a behavioral ecologist, so I don't want to speculate too much on exactly what exactly that would mean. So sorry, I don't really have a fantastic answer for you on that one.
We also have someone who noted that red foxes, no matter what their color, have white tips on their tails.
Yep.
And that's one good way to know that it's a fox, if it's a red fox. Oh,
Yep.
I'm sorry, everyone. We can't do all the questions. So thank you, Dave. That is just amazing. Thank you, everyone who was here. Dave, we are getting so many comments about how much people enjoyed this. Thank you enormously. Thank you. Good night,
It's my
everyone.
pleasure, everyone.
Bye-bye.